worldview, and if you remember, a worldview is basically the lens through which you see the world. It is the frame for reality. It answers several basic questions. It tells a story of life and of existence. And so as we evaluate and look through all the different worldviews in the weeks to come, we're going to be using these 8 questions to organize our thoughts. And the first one, and you got a few fill in the blanks there, the first one is, what is prime reality? What is the really real, is what that means. And for different worldviews, it could be that the really real is God or gods, that there's some kind of a spiritual reality. For others, it's just that there's material only, that what you see is what you get, that if you can't touch it, taste it, smell it, see it, it doesn't exist. This is the most fundamental part of a worldview. It sets the boundaries for all the other answers. Is God really good? Is a part of this. Is God really all-powerful? If there is a God, right? Can we know God? Is God personal? Is God impersonal? And how you answer that determines a lot about how you view the world. If you believe that there is a God, you're going to look at the world very differently than somebody who's an atheist. If you believe that God is just this impersonal force, or that God just kind of created the universe and he wound up the clock and set it in motion and just walked away from it all, you're going to see the world very differently than if you're a Christian. So that's the first question that every worldview answers. What is the prime reality, the most basic essence of reality? The second question is similar to that. What is the nature of external reality? The world around us, the observable world. What is the nature of external reality? Is it created or is it autonomous? Did it come about on its own? Is the observable universe chaotic or is it ordered? Is it primarily just material or is it also spiritual? And a part of this question is also the question, who's in charge of the world? Is it God? Is it us? Is it nothing? No one's in charge? Who is in charge of the world? So that's the second basic worldview question. The third one is, what is a human being? Who are we? What does it mean to be human? Are we just highly evolved animals? Are we just apes, hairless apes in clothes? Is that what we are? Are we machines? Are we mainly mechanical? We're here just to perform a function. And all of our worth and value is found in what we can produce. Are we gods? Are we the ultimate power and authority in the universe? Are we created or did we evolve? What does it mean to be human? Are we made in God's image? Do we have free will? Or is our fate a man? So then the fourth question, what happens when a person dies? What happens at death? And we'll hopefully get that one up there in a second. Okay, what happens to a person at death? Do you just go extinct? You're just snuffed out like a flame, you no longer exist? Are you reincarnated? You get a second go around?
There you go. You're back.
There we go. What happened? Do you know what happened? Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, Matt. So when you die, you're reincarnated. You come back again and try it again. Do you exist in some kind of a ghostly spirit state? Do you go to nirvana, or are you transformed in such a way that you live forever in heaven or hell? What happens at death? Death is a big part of life, and how you view death has a huge implication on how you view life. and the way that you live in the world. Okay, a fifth question is, Julia, thank you. You don't have to keep sitting there unless you just don't.
I was just waiting for the world
Okay,
to fall
all
apart.
right. And it might.
I thought it was best to just stay put.
That's a good point. Thank you. All right, number 5, why or how or why is it possible to know anything at all? How or why is it possible to know anything at all? So a big part of worldview is epistemology, the study of knowledge. How can we know anything? How do we know what we know? How do we know what is true? Some people argue we can't know anything. Some people argue that everything is subjective. Everything is relative. There is no absolute objective truth. Some people say human reason is purely the result of evolutionary processes, that again, we are just smarter monkeys. And that means that our knowing and reasoning are captive to the very processes that created it. Now you think about that. If my knowing and reasoning is the result of accidental events billions of years ago that led to the creation of the earth and then life, and then, I evolved from that. If my reasoning to even conjecture that, if my ability to even know about evolution is the result of evolution, it begins to become circular reasoning. How can I trust that? How can I trust that my knowledge and reasoning of us evolving from goop, if I can't trust that is true? So see, that's one of the loops that people get into when they believe in atheistic evolution. God, and of course, what we would say is that God created us in His image with the same capacity or similar capacity to being able to reason and know things that He has. So how do we know anything at all? The 6th question is, how do we know what is right and wrong? And again, every worldview answers these questions. These are all essential parts of a worldview. How do we know what is right and wrong? Well, as Christians, we would say that we're made in the image of God, who is the ultimate good. And through both general and special revelation, God has revealed to us. He's told us what is right and what is wrong. We've got the 10 Commandments. We've got the Golden Rule, the Sermon on the Mount. He has told us these things. Others say that morality is determined purely by human choice. If something is right or wrong, it's simply because the majority of people in society have said so. What feels good, that's what's right or wrong. They say that it's something that we developed evolutionary because it benefited our survival or the survival of our offspring or the survival of a community. And that's why we have evolved to believe certain things are right or wrong. And then some will say there is no right or wrong. You do you. Whatever benefits you, that's right. Whatever doesn't benefit you, that's wrong. So in essence, it's purely subjective. There is no objective right or wrong. The 7th question, what is the meaning of human history? What is the meaning of human history? Some worldviews say that it's to realize and fulfill the purpose of God or the gods. There's a higher power or higher powers, and the meaning of history is to fulfill their purposes, to serve them. Others say it's to bring about a utopia on earth, that we are here to create a better world than what we got. We're trying to leave behind a better earth than what we got. And then others say that it's to prepare God's people for communal life with the holy and loving God, which is what we would say. Basically, the Great Commission would be the meaning of human history. So what is the meaning of human history? And is history cyclical? Is history going someplace? What is the story of human existence? And then the 8th question is, what personal life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? So, in other words, based on what you believe about questions 1 through 7, what difference does it make? How then do you live your life based on the answers to those questions. As Christians, we would say things like to fulfill the will of God, to seek first his kingdom, to obey God, to love him. Others would say that, depending on their worldview, that their core commitment is just realize your personal potential. Self-actualization. Do as much good as you can to leave the world better than you found it. Others would say, oh, it's just to seek inner peace and happiness. Or the famous expression, he who dies with the most toys wins, right? So that's the core commitment. Just have as much stuff as you can when you go out. So what core commitment or commitments are you going to base your life on based on your worldview? That's the 8th and final question. Any questions or thoughts about any of those? I want to make sure that we understand all of those going forward. So anything I can clarify? We're going to use these questions to examine all the different worldviews we're going to look at. So yes, we will be coming back to these week after week. All right, well then let's look at this next part. Why does my worldview matter? And obviously it matters enough for you guys to be here this evening, but why should we think about our worldview? Why should we care about other people's worldviews? Most of our worldview is like an iceberg. It lies underneath the surface. It's not immediately obvious. It's one of the great things about a study like this is you kind of start digging down and you start to unpack what your worldview is. You start thinking about things you just kind of assumed. You didn't really take the time to intentionally formulate and say, well, this is what I think about this. This is what I believe about this. They're just under the surface. And so we want to reveal that. We want to understand the depths of our worldview because our worldview shapes our life. Your worldview determines how the events and circumstances of life are going to be understood. So, you take an event like, the COVID-19 pandemic. How you understand that, or something like 9/11, is dependent on your worldview. Some of the different worldview than you will understand those events differently than you. It determines how you accept the things that happen to you and how hard of a time you might have accepting some things. And then it influences what you do about it, how you act upon the things that happen to you. So your worldview really drives a lot of your feelings and your thinking and your actions. And if your worldview is faulty, if you've got an incorrect view of the world, don't you think that can maybe cause some problems in your life? If you make decisions based on assumptions that aren't true, right? I mean, my worldview could be, as people who believe in Scientology, that pain and disease and suffering is imaginary, that they aren't real. And if I believe that, and if I believe that, hey, I could stand in front of a train and it's not going to hurt me if I just believe hard enough. If that's my worldview, you think that could maybe have a negative impact on my life? Yeah. So it's important that we have the correct view of reality, the world as it is, the way it works, because if we don't, it can have dire consequences. Proverbs 29:18 says, where there is no revelation, some translations say where there is no vision, the people cast off restraint. In other words, they go wild. Where there is no revelation, people are they're adrift. But blessed is the one who heeds wisdom's instruction. Wisdom's instruction would be the biblical worldview, the world as God created it, sees it, manages it. And there are a lot of people that don't have the revelation of God. They've cast off restraint. And I think that people casting off restraint is very descriptive of our society today. Without God's revelation, we don't see what he's doing. Our worldview can be false. We don't properly see where history is going. We stumble all over ourselves. And when we don't know the purpose of life, we do just drift aimlessly through it. But if we consider God's word deeply, if we seek to interpret life through that lens, then things start to make sense. Life starts to work the way God meant it to be, and we'll be blessed for that. That's what that verse means. And if we don't understand what our worldview is, we don't understand why it makes sense, why it's true, then how can we answer other people's view of life? How can we be ready to give that defense? How can we answer back to those people who want to challenge our worldview? Bill and I were just talking about this today, that there was a thing on the news about James Madison University, and in their freshman orientation stuff, they had this whole thing that was talking about how if you're a male, if you're heterosexual, if you're cisgender, meaning you are your biological gender, if you are white, if you're between the ages of 30 and 50, and if you're a Christian, then you're an oppressor. So, yeah, that means that you are an oppressor. Whereas women and minorities and younger people and older people and lesser income people and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists, they are the oppressed. But you as a Christian, you're an oppressor. That's a worldview. And that's a worldview that is gaining more and more traction today. We have to be ready and able to give a reasonable answer to that. This is not just something theoretical to sit around and enjoy a talk on a Wednesday night. This is life or death. This is the survival of our country. And this is, will churches thrive in the years to come, or will we be like Canada, where pastors get arrested simply for holding a worship service on a Sunday morning? Where are we going to be? That's why worldview matters. Now, there are 5 tests for any worldview. Okay, so as we compare and contrast different worldviews in the weeks to come, these help us to critique other worldviews and clarify our own worldview. All right, so the first test is coherence. Is it consistent or is it contradictory? So do you understand what your worldview means? If you don't, or the worldview you're studying, seek clarity. Is it coherent? Does it make internal sense, or is it self-contradictory? And we'll see many examples of that. And another important part of this is definitions matter. One of the big things happening today is the rewriting of the English language. Terms and words that we thought we knew what they meant are being redefined to mean something different. For example, that James Madison thing where they're taking, most of the people in this room and calling us oppressors. They do that, they say, because they want to create a welcoming and inclusive environment. Now, how does calling me an oppressor make me feel welcome or included? So when you hear welcoming and inclusive, that doesn't mean what you think it means anymore. All right, so definitions matter. Second test is correlation. Does it seem to match our experience of reality? Again, if I believe that I can step right off the roof of this building and not fall, if that's what I believe, that if I can just conceptualize it, if I can just speak it into reality, that I can step off this roof and not fall, is that worldview going to match up with reality? No, because I'm going to fall, right? So that fails the test of correlation. The second test is comprehensiveness. How well does this worldview account for all of life? How does it account for all of life? See, the thing about worldviews is a lot of worldviews will have a little bit of truth in them. They'll latch onto one little aspect that says, okay, well, yeah, that's true. But then they make these assumptions and leaps to other beliefs that aren't true. So how comprehensive is that worldview? Is it only, so you take, for example, the prosperity gospel way of looking at things. Okay? Its worldview is that, hey, God's not going to let bad things happen to you. If you believe enough and you're a good enough Christian, you're just going to, be blessed. You're going to come into all this wealth and money. God's going to expand your tent, all of this stuff. Well, sometimes that happens for some people. That may happen. But is that comprehensive? Does that have anything to say about when bad things happen to good people? No. This was the problem with Job and his friends. We all just studied that in Sunday school recently. Their worldview, they had certain worldviews that you reap what you sow. That if you're suffering all of this, you must have done something wrong. God is punishing you. That's not a comprehensive worldview. It's only looking at a piece of the puzzle. It neglects so much more. The other test, the fourth test, is consistency. How consistently can you live according to that worldview? How consistently can you live that worldview out? Is it something that you can stick with? And then the final one is commitment. Is it worth your all? Is that belief system worth devoting your all to it? Other questions that you might ask when you're evaluating somebody's worldview is things like, why do you believe this? Why is your belief right? Why is my belief wrong? Those are good questions if you're dialoguing with someone. Another good question to ask as you're looking at a worldview is, what else must I believe or not believe if that's true? So if something is true, if there are 70 virgins waiting for any Muslim man who, suicide bombs, a bus, if that's true, then what else must I believe or not believe? You obviously can't believe in a loving God who is full of grace and mercy if that's what you believe. Another good question, how does this make you feel? A lot of people have worldviews and beliefs that don't make them feel particularly good. Not that that's, the end all be all, but if it's unsettling in your spirit, then maybe there's something to think about there. And then another good question is, what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? Somebody who claims to be an atheist, okay? What if you're wrong and there is a God and there is a heaven and a hell? Then you risk spending eternity in hell. What if I'm wrong as a Christian and there is no God, and when we die, that's it? That we die and that's it. But I've lived a life that served others. I lived a life that was full of joy and peace and humility, right? To me, I think the worst mistake would be to be the atheist and be wrong. So what if you're wrong is a good question. And then the last thing, in thinking, any questions or thoughts about those? Any comments on those 5 tests? All right, then let's look at the last little thing here. How can you share with someone who has a different worldview than you do? What are some tips for having a conversation with somebody like that? Well, the first thing you want to do is listen to their story. Just listen. Listen with a critical ear, listen and analyze, but listen to their story. Don't just, start talking. Sit and listen to what they have to say. If you listen to them, they're more apt to listen to you. And then when they do, tell the Christian story in such a way that it addresses ultimate concerns. Those are the 8 questions. So as we're telling the Christian story, we're wanting to talk about where we came from, why we're here, why the world is in such a mess that it is, and what can we do about it? What's the point of life? Where's all this going? The dignity and worth and sacredness of human beings. Those are the kinds of things we include as we're telling someone about Jesus, because those are the ultimate questions of life. It's not just about where you go when you die. That's an important one. There's so many more important things to include. And tell the Christian story so that it subverts their story. right? So as you've listened to their faith story, or you listen to their worldview, as you're telling yours, keep that in mind. How can you, for example, you take, again, a Muslim, and we'll look at Islam. Islam's more than just a religion, it's a worldview. And in that worldview, God is not a loving personal God. There is no concept in Islam of God as a father or of God's love. It's all about God's will and submitting. That's what Islam means, submission, submitting to God's will. So as you tell your story, you want to paint the picture of what a loving, caring, personal God is and why that makes a difference to you. That subverts their story. That makes them question, well, which is better to believe, that or this? Practice what you preach. Live out those core commitments of your worldview. Is your worldview as a Christian consistent? Can you live it out consistently? Are you living it out consistently? And invite them to make his story their own. That's the way every gospel conversation should eventually get to. It may be several conversations down the road, but eventually that's where we want to be. We want to invite this person to make God's story their story. Any thoughts or questions on this? And one of my goals through all this study is to equip you to be able to do these things. For you to be equipped to be able to do all of this. Any thoughts or questions on that? All right, we are then going to move on. Let me go. I need to swap out my PowerPoint now. Can you help me with that? Absolutely. No, I swap it. Yeah, I swap it. Can I test it? I'll just do it. Yep, that's it. All right. So we are going to now talk about a biblical worldview. We're going to start with what we know, right? We're going to start with our worldview, how Christians see and have seen the world. I mentioned this book last week. Chuck Colson's book is called How Now Shall We Live? And he argues that one of the church's greatest failures in modern history is the failure to see and present Christianity as a life system. That it's not a religion, it's not just a set of beliefs, that it is a worldview that governs every area of existence, that it answers all of the ultimate questions. And he writes this, he says, we must show the world that Christianity is more than a private belief, more than personal salvation. We must show that it is a comprehensive life system that answers all of humanity's age-old questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Does my life have any meaning or purpose? And so as Christians, we believe the biblical worldview offers the only viable, rational answer to those kinds of questions. That's what we would say, that the biblical worldview is the worldview. It truly encompasses all of life, history, culture, thought, every aspect of creation. In fact, Colson goes on to say, only Christianity offers a way to live in line with the real world. Only Christianity offers a way to live in line with the real world. Now, the church fathers, back in the first few centuries, they had a saying that said, all truth is God's truth. All truth is God's truth. And that's based on this idea from the Gospel of John. It says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Greek word for word is logos. And logos in the Greek, it literally means word or idea or even thought. But in Greco-Roman philosophy, it carried with it this deeper implication that it was about the rational pattern of the created world. So the logos, this is where we get the word logic. So the logos was logic, it was reason, it was rational, it was the way the world is. So in a way, you can really say, in the beginning was the rationale of the ordered universe. And that is Jesus. And that's where Paul gets this idea from. For in him, all things were created. He's the Logos. He's the thought. He's the idea. He's the word by which the universe was created. Things in heaven, on earth, visible, invisible, thrones, powers, rulers, authorities, all things, everything. There's nothing that was not created in and through and for Jesus. And not only did he create them, but it says in him all things hold together. He sustains all of creation. Jesus does. So Jesus is the essence. He is the Logos. This is the foundational idea to the Christian worldview. We hold that the universe was created by an intelligent personality, by God. And because of that, the universe has an intelligible order. The universe makes sense. It's a knowable, rational order. That is an inherently Christian belief. And we see this through observation, through science, through math. We can deduce these things. Every day, we see this truth in the physical order of creation. And just as God created the universe to work along physical laws, like the law of gravity, the law of motion, the conservation of energy, there are these laws by which the physical universe works. As Christians, we also believe that God created the world to work along moral laws. There are physical laws and there are moral laws that are just as immutable, just as inherent in the universe. Just as the law of gravity prescribes how objects move and relate to one another, so God's moral law prescribes how people are to relate to one another. And those laws are just as unbreakable without consequence as the law of gravity. This, by the way, is what the biblical writers call wisdom. So when you read about wisdom, that's what it's talking about. Understanding how God's world was designed to work and how we best live in it. That's wisdom. So the fact is that, and this is the title of the study here, that we have worldviews that are at war today. And always have been. There have always been competing worldviews. I mean, since Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the garden and believed Satan's lie, in essence, they rejected God's worldview. They rejected the way God created the world, the way God gave them to view the world and think about the world. They rejected that and adopted their own false worldview. That's what they did. Not the world as it was, but the world as they wanted it to be, where they call the shots. They got to determine what was right and wrong, what was good and evil. So there have always been competing worldviews that are at war with each other. But we can really organize the myriad worldviews around us today into three major, really, civilizations. There are three major civilizations on earth: the Western world, the Eastern world, and the Islamic world. And really, most of the world, and especially most schools of thought and religious beliefs, can really kind of be put under those three major umbrellas. Well, the Western world, of which we're a part, is based on the Judeo-Christian values and beliefs, and also Greco-Roman philosophy. People have said that Western civilization is part Jerusalem and part Athens. You've got Platonic and philosophy. You've got all of that, but then you've got the biblical values and ethics there. So that's the Western world's civilization and sort of where our thoughts have come from. The Eastern world is based on the philosophy of Confucius and upon Buddhist and Hindu beliefs and values. That's the Eastern worldview. And then the Islamic worldview is based on the Quran, and not just the Quran, but all the teachings of the Muslim clerics. So there's a lot of things that Muslims believe that aren't even in the Quran, but they've had these other Muslim clerics over the centuries that have taught different things. For the most part, the Islamic and Eastern worldviews have been remarkably consistent. Now, that's not to say that you don't have like your Shia and your Sunni. You don't, you obviously have some strict interpretations and some loose interpretations. You've got, different, denominations, kind of an idea, but they all essentially believe the same basic worldview. They're amazingly consistent. But in the Western world, a split has developed, and it's been developing for a long time. And that today we can classify that as being a split between the Judeo-Christian worldview and what is a multicultural postmodern worldview. This multicultural global postmodernity is a direct refutation and competition with the Judeo-Christian worldview and way of thinking. So in our syllabus, if you've got this list right here, you'll notice that we'll spend a week or a session on the Eastern worldview. We'll spend a session on the Islamic worldview. We'll also do a session on the New Age movement, which is sort of a spin-off. It's kind of a weird conglomeration of Western thought with Eastern thought. We'll talk about that some as well. But we're going to take 6 sessions to unpack postmodernism, essentially. And where we're going to go all the way back, we're going to trace these different worldview schools of thought and philosophy so that we see and understand where we are today and where all this comes from. So, yeah, sure, Islam is a concern. We should know Islam. We should pray for Muslims. We should be a part of evangelizing that part of the world. But that is nowhere near the threat that postmodernism is. And that is what we see playing out in our country today. But we need to establish a baseline worldview of historic Christian theism, what we believe to be the true worldview, the right way in which the world is, the way it was meant to be, the way it will someday be restored to be. And we're going to use this as the standard by which we're going to evaluate all these other worldviews. And we're going to use the 8 basic questions. So James, you want to know, are we going to answer those 8 questions? Yes, we're going to answer those 8 questions starting right now. So the first question is the question of prime reality. And listen, at any time, please, if you've got a thought, a question, an anecdote, raise your hand, speak out, jump up, I don't know, whatever, something, get my attention. But I want to hear from you as well. All right, so prime reality. And the answer that the Christian worldview gives is that the infinite person of God revealed in the Bible is the prime reality. And he is triune, transcendent, but immanent. He's omniscient, sovereign, and good. Now, we could spend a session on each one of those attributes of God, but we're not. So we're going to go through these pretty quick. So the first is that he is infinite, right? That means that God is measureless. He's singular. He is the end-all, be-all of existence. He is the only self-existent one. This is what the name Yahweh means. When God revealed his name to Moses, he said, I am who I am. He is the great I am. He doesn't exist because of anyone or anything else. He is. So his very name basically means he is the prime reality. He is the wholly other one and the source of all other reality. He's also personal. He's not a force. He's not an energy. He has personality, and there are 2 basic elements of personality: self-reflection and self-determination. So self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-determination, the ability to have the capacity to act, to have agency. Those are 2 essential elements of having personality. So that means that God knows himself, and that means that God has the ability to think and to act according to his will. Personality. And personality is one of the elements of God's image in us, right? We have personality. Some of us really have some personality, right? And like God, we have personal attributes. We have character. Again, some of us are a character. So personality is a big part of who God is, and he is triune. Okay, so Deuteronomy 6:4 tells us that God is one. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the Shema. But within the oneness of the Godhead are 3 unique and distinct persons. Now, this is one of those. Abby was talking about some concepts she's learning in school at Augusta Christian, and she says, I just go, there's mind-blowing. So the Trinity is, it is so hard to wrap our minds around this. We do not believe in three gods. We do not believe that God appears in three modes. That's not what we believe either. We believe that God is three persons that are together co-equally, co-eternally God. And really the Trinity helps us understand how the Bible can say that God is love. Not that God has love, not that God does love, but God is love. And how could God be love before he created people? Who was there to love? Well, God exists and is in an eternal community of three in one. And it's in that relationship, it's in that communal nature of God that God is love, even independent of us. That also speaks to how we have this fundamental need for and desire for and capacity for relationship. That's part of being made in God's image. He is triune. He's also transcendent. Imagine what transcendent means. It's a big word. Say again? Above it all. Yeah, you transcend something, you're above it, right? God is above and beyond the universe. And the Bible talks about him holding the universe in the palm of his hand, right? It's pretty amazing when you think about how big the universe is. He is above and beyond the universe that he created. He's separate from his creation, right? God and his creation are separate things. God is not his creation, although we can find him revealed through his creation, which brings us to immanent. So those sound like contradictions. Transcendent is up there, out there. Immanent is close, near, here, with us. So God is near and accessible. He is Emmanuel, God with us. That very name is about the immanence of God. And so, yes, God is transcendent above his creation, but he reveals himself through his creation. He's present with us everywhere we go. There's nowhere we can escape him, as the psalmist says in Psalm 139. And this is what Paul and the author of Hebrews mean when they're talking about Jesus sustaining and holding together the creation, the universe. God is above and beyond his creation, but he's in his creation. He's actively at work in his creation. He's also omniscient. What does omniscient mean? All-knowing. God knows everything there is to know. Everything that's knowable, God knows it. He sees it from the beginning of time to the end of time and beyond. That means that God is the ultimate source of all knowledge and all intelligence. Truly, all truth is God's truth. That is a very true statement. This is why we can say that. And all there is to ever know, all there is that you will ever yet learn, God already knows it. And he's always known it. He's omniscient. He's sovereign. Now, we use that word a lot. We sing that word in songs and stuff like that. To be sovereign means that because God is infinite and omniscient and transcendent and immanent, because of those things, he is sovereign. He is sovereign over all creation. Basically, sovereignty is God's all-encompassing rule and reign over the entire universe. God gets to call the shots. There's no higher power he has to go ask for permission from. He is the ultimate authority. That is what it means for God to be sovereign, and God is good. Now, the essence of God's character is goodness, and really all the other attributes of God flow from his goodness. In the book, The Universe Next Door, James Sire says, do I have this? No, I don't have that there. I think it's in your notes. He says, there is no sense in which goodness surpasses God. So in other words, goodness is not something that God lives up to. That there is no standard of good outside of God. So there is no goodness that surpasses God. And God doesn't surpass goodness. God is good. All the time. And all the time, God is good. That's such a basic statement of faith. As being is the essence of his nature, goodness is the essence of his character. So there is no other standard of good outside of God. He is the standard. And God's goodness is expressed through two things, primarily his holiness and his love. 1 John 1:5 says that God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. In other words, God is true. There's no lie within God. God is good. There's no bad within God. God is righteous. There is no wickedness within God. God is holy. There is no evil within God. God is holy. And God is love. 1 John 4:16 says that. And so Jesus' sacrificial service for us, dying on the cross, God's mercy and grace, these are extensions of the goodness of his love. And there are people that want to hold those two things as contrasting, right? We get this false dichotomy today between grace and truth. And you remember in John chapter 1, it says that Jesus came in grace and truth. So we think about truth, holiness, right? That there's this absolute truth, this absolute standard that we are held to. And then there's grace and love. So we have a lot of people today that want to hang on to the grace and the love. And they want to say, oh, God is love. God would never judge. God would never punish. God just wants you to be happy. God is love. Well, God is love, but God is also holy. God has absolute standards. God is just and righteous. You have to have both for God to be good. Because if God is only all love and never punishes wickedness, what kind of love is that? But if God was all just holiness and just strictly holding us to these impossible standards that we couldn't live up to and had no love, that's not good either. It requires God's holiness and love for us to understand that God is good. So that's the first question, prime reality. Any thoughts or questions on that? That's a big one. I mean, we just basically did a whole systematic theology on God in 10 minutes. So any thoughts or questions on that? I mean, seriously, I spent like weeks in a theology class covering what we just did. So it's an iceberg. We're skimming the surface. It's just anything, anybody? All right, the next one, and again, we're going to get through some of this tonight. We will continue next week. External reality. Christians believe that God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing, and he created it to work with the uniformity of cause and effect in an open system. Now, what does all that mean? Well, ex nihilo means out of nothing. It means that God, as the prime reality, is the source of everything else. If there was something that God had to use to create, where did that something come from? It would have to come from something greater than God, which makes no sense. So God is the first mover. He is the prime source of all that there is. He created the universe out of nothing. He didn't make it out of some pre-existent chaos. He didn't make it out of himself. He thought it, spoke it, and there it was. Don't you wish you could do that? We can't. And then he created a universe that is uniform, and it's based on this idea of cause and effect. In other words, God created an orderly world, not a chaotic world. He created a world for clarity, not for confusion. Really, the basis of science, the entire scientific process, the entire rise of science and Western civilization is because of this belief. Because science wouldn't be possible if the world wasn't observable, if it wasn't ordered, if there weren't observable laws, you couldn't measure it, you couldn't predict it, right? The world works in a uniform, consistent, dependable way. That's the only way math is possible. The only way science can work. Isaiah 45:18 says, he who created the heavens, he is God. He who fashioned and made the earth, he founded it. He did not create it to be empty. And that word empty there is the same word in Genesis 1 that says the earth was empty and void. It was just, he didn't create it to be just this blob. He formed it. He fashioned it. He made it to be inhabited. He made it livable, right? We don't live on Venus. We live on Earth. And he made it so that we could live here. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, of shalom. So God is not a God who's created a disordered world. And then we also believe that it's an open system. Now, what does that mean, an open system? It means that the universe and our lives are not pre-programmed. We're not just running some program like your computer might do. Yes, God is sovereignly in control of the universe. He is intimately involved in guiding this world by his will, but God also created the world to be open to human involvement. Now listen to what that means. God created us with a capability to further his created order, right? He put us in charge. He said, take what I've made and rule over it, have dominion. Use it. Find new ways of taking these rocks and doing something with them. Find ways of harnessing the power of wind and water. He created a world that we could interact with, that we could have an impact on. We could do something with it, good or bad. And as we know, we said, okay, let's wreck it. Thank you, God. It's like you buy your teenager a nice new car and say, now you can drive this for years and years and years. I'm not going to make you pay for it or your insurance. I'm going to cover all that for you. Just don't wreck it. Okay, and you go out and you wreck it right away, right? That's what we did. He gave us the keys and we ruined it all. Adam and Eve made a choice that had impact. It impacted all of creation. The entire universe was impacted by their choice, which led God to then make a sovereign choice to redeem fallen humanity, to restore his world to good through Jesus. Basically saying that the world, the universe is an open system means that our choices matter. Human decisions have an effect. If everything was predestined, if everything was predetermined, that's what fate and destiny. People who believe in fate, destiny, people who are worried about horoscopes and looking at, is Mars in the house of whatever, those kinds of people, they believe that our actions and choices are predetermined. Which means that what you and I do doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. No matter what you do, you're fated to experience what you experience. We're just puppets along for the ride. That's not what Christians believe. Let's see. I think we're going to have to stop right there because humanity is about as in-depth as talking about God. So any questions about what we've talked about so far? Is it making sense? Are you, is what I'm talking about, okay, yeah, I've studied that in Sunday school. Yeah, I knew that. I believe that. Yeah, I've heard that preached before. Any thoughts that were just kind of head scratchers? Yes, sir.
I said this last week, but we were running out of time. I thought I understood worldview, but this is so complicated. It has to be complicated because everybody got one. That's
right. If it's complicated, it's because everybody has one. That's right. So if you got 30, people in a room, in a way, you kind of have 30 different worldviews because we all view the world a little bit differently than everybody else, right? But what we have to decide is what do we have in common? What are the basic beliefs that we all share as Christians? That if you're going to say, I'm a Christian, it's going to necessarily mean that you believe these certain things. We might interpret them differently. Somebody who's a Calvinist is going to have a little bit of a different understanding about this whole open system thing, a little bit of a different understanding about how salvation happens. But we essentially believe the same story of God's work in the world. We just have some different opinions on the way some of that is going on behind the scenes. Not to say that one's right or wrong. I'm just saying we have different perspectives of what's behind the curtain. And ultimately, only God knows that. And someday we'll all get to heaven and we'll find out where we were right and where we were wrong, won't we? So yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. And my goal, and I know it can seem a little complicated at first, especially, but my goal through this study is to help simplify all this. And as we go through these 8 questions with each of these worldviews, you start to see where these things diverge and what difference that makes. Anything so far about God about reality, anything like that we've talked about?
Yeah, so the small topic.
Yeah, the small topics, God and reality. Any questions? You've got that, right? You're good. Got it all figured out. All right, very good.